all of these things.
Wow.
Was there water in it?
No. Dude, why do you look like you just like you just look like you saw a ghost?
Dude, what did you do? You ruined the podcast.
I know. What's an immigrant?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
An immigrant is someone who goes to a country from another country.
Oh, like me.
Yeah.
I'm an immigrant. But I don't feel like one because I only came here when I was 2 years old.
Mm-hmm.
My parents moved here in their 30s, I think, recently married, just had me, and apparently I found my way onto the conveyor belt with all the circulating suitcases and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So a few seconds late, like I think they pulled me off of it, but I would have been like on my way back across the sea. But luckily, I made it here, moved to Missouri, and then immigrated to my native Ohio. And the immigrant struggle is something that a lot of Americans can relate to. More so than probably any country on this planet, the immigrant struggle is something that is core to the American identity. America was founded by immigrants. The colonists from England who arrived here were immigrants seeking all sorts of refuge and freedom. And America's whole history is basically the history of immigration. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Immigration and genocide.
You can't separate the two sides of the same coin. But today we're here to talk about one and not the other.
True. Yeah. But everyone in America, almost everyone, is an immigrant. Yes, definitely. Like they say, America's the melting pot. You really get the chance to kind of, when you talk about American culture, it's really like a mix of a variety of multiple different cultures, right?
Like a chili, like a really nice hearty chili full of all different kinds of beans and meat. And I'm just really hungry, really craving something like that right now, which is why my mind is on it. But I guess what are we trying to emphasize with immigration? What would you say is your take on the immigrant struggle if you had to sum it up in a sentence or less?
So, one of the things that's very prominent right now in regards to immigration is border control and how immigrants can enter or not be able to enter the country. And so one of the things in regards to that is that under Trump's administration, we've had a lot of talk about a border wall. We've had talk about ICE kind of deporting people, ICE causing a lot of issues in regards to international students who want to study here.
At my school in North Carolina, even there was a thing last year where ICE was conducting raids, not on campus. I think that's technically illegal, but in homes around campus, very close to campus. And I go to a school that has a very nice policy for undocumented students, and so I know several undocumented students. And I remember that was just such a weird dynamic then, because I mean, they're my friends, protected under certain laws but not all, and there ICE was just a few blocks down conducting raids, ready to get deportations on the road. It just was surreal to me, Well, why do you think this is such a hot button issue? Why do you think the country is pretty polarized in terms of how it feels about immigration, both legal and illegal?
Yeah, there's a lot of varying sentiments and opinions out there that certain people belong in this country and certain people don't, and certain people think that there is a certain group that should be prioritized in this country, who are like natural born U.S. citizens, and like there's a group of people who think that they should get the priority, and then there's another group of people who think that it should be like everyone who is here, even the people who are here illegally, should be granted a pathway to gaining their legal citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And then other people think that those illegal immigrants really have no place in this country, and that they came here legally. Like, why did they do that? They should have came through the legal process. But I mean, that's a whole nother issue of like how difficult it is to become a legal citizen when you are an immigrant. But obviously, you know, there has to be rules when you have borders.
Right. And that's the constant struggle. You know, you're talking about the difficulties of immigrating here within the rules. And I'll talk about the example of my parents. And my dad immigrated here as a what you would call a skilled worker. He had his PhD. He was ready to work in a biology lab and, in a phrase, contribute to the American research scene. And even the most conservative viewpoint would view that as a positive contribution to the country in terms of immigration. He was rejected for his visa, I think 3 times, and had to wait in a very long line, and ended up waiting around 2, 3, maybe 4 years maybe, to finally get a legal pathway to this country. And so that's his situation. Now just imagine you're not a quote unquote skilled worker, rather you're a refugee, or you're trying to flee like terrible conditions in your community or your country, political persecution, government persecution, anything like that. You don't have 4 years to just sit around and wait for your documents to be approved. Sometimes it's your human impulse for safety and for life and liberty, which are American values that we want to champion. Sometimes that supersedes your ability to follow the law. You know, I'm sure that anyone would want to do things legally rather than illegally. But I think that perspective is another really strong one, that the people who are coming here undocumented are doing so for a reason. And again, I think this goes back to one of the themes of this show, that why do we politicize problems instead of try to solve them? There's a reason that people are trying to come here both legally and illegally. And instead of making it a whole political thing of should they do it, should they not, are you for immigration, against it, why don't we look at why they're doing it? Why don't we look at why the border might be too loose or too tight and try to solve some of these problems? You know what I'm saying?
How would you classify someone as an immigrant as opposed to an American?
I think that's a really good question. And I almost feel that it's a very subjective and personal question that only the person themselves can answer. I think that to be an American at its core reflects the fact that you value the core values that this country was founded upon. We talked about these in prior episodes, but I think you and I both agree that the core principles of American democracy, you know, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, a free press, a free media, the right to free speech, all of these very basic liberties that were championed in America are what make the country what it is. And when I think of who gets to call themselves American, I would think of a person who believes in that really core visceral identity, you know, and everything else, it's just your own culture. If you come here and with your own culture and want to celebrate it, that's awesome. That's adding to the vibrancy of this country. So when I think of immigrant, I think of a person who's here and maybe on the way to discovering these ideals, or at least that's the way I think it should be.
So if you were to categorize it as a Venn diagram, how would you put it?
Interesting. I guess that brings up the point at what point does an immigrant become an American, if that ever happens, or is there ever a distinction between the two? Mm-hmm. And I think that you become American when you decide to be. You know, again, it comes to this subjective choice that I want to be in this country. I believe in this country. I want my kids to grow up here, or I want to contribute in some way. And it doesn't have to be a nationalistic thing. at all. You don't have to be pro-America on every front in order to believe in the principles the country was founded upon, or maybe you want to adjust some of the principles. Maybe there's things that you think are wrong in the way that the country was structured initially or now, but that idea of believing in American democracy and doing whatever it takes to push forward, bring freedom and liberty to all, I think that's the core of what it means to be American. And as soon as you take that decision to believe in and abide by those principles is when the Venn diagram converges into one. And I guess that's one of the other big points of our show. It's kind of the fact that it's a choice to be a true American by educating yourself, informing yourself of all the things that we do well and all the things that we do really poorly, and having a really good idea of everything that's going on and wanting to do better.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that I picked up on that you said there is that people who come to this country, the culture doesn't have much to do with defining one as American as much as holding true to the principles of American democracy does, liberty, as you mentioned. And one thing that I want to ask you is that, every country has a particular culture that, certain individuals can identify citizens of those countries with. So would you say there is an American culture, or would you say there is really not a definable American culture?
That's a good question. I think that my instant answer would probably be yes. I'm thinking of something very specific. You could probably imagine what it is. The thing is, though, America is one of the biggest countries on the planet, just by landmass, and very ethnically diverse, even within itself. Like the culture in like South Florida couldn't be more different than the culture in upstate New York, for example. So I think one of the core features of American culture is the idea of individualism, the fact that individual rights matter, and when you're moving through society, you view yourself as this independent entity that can do whatever you want in whatever capacity. This idea of personal liberty. I think that's part of American culture. People will say like, well, I mean, there's freedom in Germany, there's freedom in like United Kingdom, like blah, 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 XYZ. What do you think there's things that are distinct about American liberties that, or American culture in that respect, that are different than, all the other places where you are still very much free to be yourself in the world?
That's a very good question, and I definitely have to look more into the cultures of those other countries, which I'm not that aware of. But I think that just speaking to America specifically, I think that there's definitely been kind of an effect that American liberty has had on the way that
you're right.
This has spread throughout the world.
You're saying it was maybe pioneered here, and American democracy might have been a model in other places.
Yeah,
certainly.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So that whole idea of personal liberty and stuff is for sure one of the unifying ideas in this country. The other thing that comes to mind is the capitalistic drive in America. I think more so than, obviously capitalism is a economic and social system that exists all over the world, but I think more so than any country, the American experiment has been a capitalistic one. How far can we stretch capitalism until it breaks is what I'm thinking of. There's so many examples of how basically almost every part of our lives is predicated on some sort of capitalistic decision.
I mean, Americans love the free market. America as a country, as a government system, loves the free market. And there's obviously a lot of sentiment out there in regards to how much good or bad the free market is doing us, whether we need more government control or less government control. It's definitely a huge issue. And yeah, and there's like, I mean, there's just so many, there's a lot of other like stereotypes like that associated with America as well, that like, you know, pizza, burgers and fries.
Yeah.
Like, there's just an endless
I mean, we'll
list.
eat anything, right? We'll eat anything and everything, and as long as it's deep fried and packaged and sold in a shiny box, right? And that just goes to show you how capitalism and American democracy are just inextricable, and you just cannot separate them. And it's like I said, it shows up everywhere. Like healthcare, for example, that's one of the most extreme examples of American capitalism at its finest in air quotes.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a really, really convoluted, messed up system. If you want to speak more to that.
Oh yeah, you know, there's been so much going on in the healthcare sphere recently in regards to whether we want to have public healthcare options or not, whether we want to keep healthcare totally private. And there's been a lot of people who've been advocating for public healthcare, and then a lot of people are arguing that public healthcare is just going to be a waste of money and that it's not going to be good and that it's going to destroy the free market economy and whatnot. I know there's several different arguments out there for and against. So yeah, and I mean, right now there's like, you know, if Trump gets reelected, we're probably going to see more of a direction towards privatization of healthcare and keeping healthcare totally private. And if Biden comes into the picture, then we might see a little bit more swing
to the public option.
Swing back towards the public option that kind
Affordable Care Act, Obamacare.
Yeah, Obamacare. Maybe it'll be Biden care this time.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. Well, the thing with healthcare, that's another thing that is just politicized to no end in this country. And I mean, there's reasons why, but it's just crazy because no other country has politicized something like a basic right to healthcare or to be a healthy person in the way that it has been done in America. And a big part of that has to do with the lobbying and all the PACs created on behalf of pharmaceutical industries and healthcare and insurance companies and stuff like that. And there's a lot of really powerful players who want the healthcare system to be convoluted in the way that it is, to be confusing, to have all sorts of loopholes, to charge exorbitant amounts of money for life-saving drugs. And that's very American, you know?
Yeah.
This idea that we can put a price tag even on something like human well-being, which is essentially what's happening. Great example would be like, so there's this, there was this company called Valiant. I'm not sure if you heard of it or not, but it got super big. I think this was maybe 10 years ago, but Valiant was a pharmaceutical research and development drug design company type of thing. And it was consulted by this guy named Martin Shkreli, and he totally restructured the way that Valiant would function. So when you think of a pharmaceutical company, a drug company, you would think of a company that's invested in healthcare, in caring for people, in creating the best possible product to make sure that society is healthier. But what they did is, I think they spent around 2% of their total budget on research and development of drugs. Just 2%. Almost 80% on acquiring other companies, on advertising, marketing, things like that. So they really didn't have a significant product or any, like, they were not compelled to create in the medical sphere. They were much more run like a business, like a corporation. And so eventually Valiant like closed over. People realized that this was basically a scam. And there was all sorts of consequences for the people involved. But that's just one example of how American capitalism infiltrates even the most basic aspects of human existence, like health.
Yeah, and another one of the major issues that always comes up in the news is gun control. And we talk about whether or not we should abandon our Second Amendment rights. And, guns are very American since by being like having been written in as a Second Amendment right. And so a lot of people kind of argue the utility of whether or not our Second Amendment rights should still be still be available, or whether gun sales should be more restricted in sense of who can or cannot buy guns to limit the mass shooting sprees that we would often have in past years and still sometimes have time to time. And there's a lot of debate about how gun control laws kind of help or aggravate the situation in terms of increasing the rate of mass shootings, or whether it has any effect on it at all. And there's a lot of argument about, well, if we do gun control, then there could be the fact that only the bad guys have the guns and then the good guys don't because it goes to the black market. But then there's also like several other arguments out there as well, where other people might argue that, okay, if we take away guns, then like shooting rates in general will decrease by a lot. But all in all, gun rights, they're like the Second Amendment rights to Americans. We've had it for a very, very long time, but right now it's like at the forefront and it gets politicized a lot.
Yeah, I mean, just another great example of things that don't need to be politicized that get heavily politicized. The thing with the arguments for decreased gun control, one thing that people will bring up is why the Second Amendment was created in the first place. So we fast forward back to the 1776, and the founding fathers are thinking about all the different ways that American democracy could be undermined and how can we protect against them. And then comes the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And so the idea was that if a tyrannical government imposes way too much power over its citizens, then the citizenry should be equipped to fight back. So that's the whole idea. And some people will cite that as evidence for why these increased gun control measures are necessary. But when I think about that, that particular argument, I'm just wondering if people realize that 1776 and 2020 are very, very different times. Number one, if you're concerned about a tyrannical government, we've basically sold our rights to them already. If they wanna mess up us as people, I don't know if the fact that I can go buy a gun whenever I want is gonna protect me from their F-16s and nuclear warheads and whatnot. So that's point number one. And then point number two, I just don't know that society is trending that way to allow a government like that to do that. But I guess that's more of a personal take. So at any rate, gun control is something that is always like a hot button issue, and there's all sorts of lobbying behind it, and a lot of interests on both sides that have a lot of money connected to any type of gun legislation. I know one thing in particular that was lobbied super heavily for by the NRA was the fact that gun control isn't allowed to be studied, which, there's a very clear vested interest there. And it goes back to our episode about lobbying and all the ways that influences our politics. But again, point being that the way that our country works is that things that don't need to be politicized can be for the benefit of different interest groups.
And whether or not something needs to be politicized can be argued as well. But in general, like when we say politicization, what we're referring to is the fact that things get kind of blown out of proportion in the sense that they become a bit distracting. But yeah, even then can be argued for or against.
Distracting from what? From the real problems.
Distracting from the real problems. Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And so there's this idea that when you politicize something, you turn it into a left versus right issue instead of like a public health issue that everyone can get behind. Like the masks, for example. Well, we can just get a little off topic there. I have no idea how that's become a political debate in America. I mean, it's only happening in America. The rest of the world has kind of figured out that, we don't have to get political about this. We can all agree that there's a public health measure and we want to stop this virus. Let's just, do it for the sake of everybody. But here, it's become a very, very stark left versus right thing. And a lot of why that happens is because of the way that media outlets will portray that something has to be a left versus right thing.
There is a lot of that sentiment stemming from other areas as well. I feel like that people feel like they're being oppressed in a certain way if they're being forced to wear the mask.
I am a little bit pessimistic given the current trends and given how a public health epidemic is being used as a political tool in many ways. But we'll see. We'll see what this election holds, and there should be some interesting debates there. So
there's definitely been a lot of sentiments being thrown around in that arena and a lot of different viewpoints. But not to get stuck on that one point, there's also so many events that come to the forefront of politics, such as terrorism and just kind of limiting terrorist activity, both foreign and domestic. There's a lot of talk about education, and I know that we personally are very affected by education in the sense that currently the way that education, like higher education loan systems work is, in my opinion, completely like very, very difficult for a student to come out of university and be able to pay off loans if they had to take them because of the way that these interest systems are set up, which kind of just are sort of, in my opinion, feel like they're engineered to drive you bankrupt. And like, it's just, I mean, it's crazy. I'm sure you have experience with that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's the way that tuition is overpriced in this country, again, is pretty unique. Goes back to the whole capitalism thing and how I guess the reason that tuition is so overpriced is because we, number one, have this notion of meritocracy, that some schools are better than others, or like there's some schools where you do want to send your kids versus not. And this doesn't apply strictly to colleges. It also applies to public schools, high schools, school systems. And it goes back to the fact that certain areas are taxed differently than other areas. And we can go all the way back to something like redlining, which, as we said, was what determined property values in different areas, which determines who's going to move into those areas. So it's all very connected. If you have a certain demographic living in a certain area, and it's not a very well-to-do demographic, and the public schools are bad, and no one wants to move into there, you're creating these streams and cycles of people that just cannot get out. And on the other hand, you're giving systematic advantages to people outside of these communities. People want to move there. The property value is high. The schools are good. There's a pipeline to top universities, XYZ. And yeah, my point was just that all of these issues are way more connected than we'd like to think. And we shouldn't be distracted by all of the little stories. Well, I'm not saying not to pay attention to all the little things that come up here and there, little news events, but these are the big picture problems that the country faces and has faced for the last several hundred years.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily I just want to put it out there that I'm not advocating for making colleges free per se or anything like that. I'm personally undecided on the opinion as of right now. But I definitely think that, just being able to pay off that loan is so difficult. But I don't know about quality wise, how it would affect versus not affect. And I don't think any of us can know until we finally make a decision on what direction we want to go in. And, other than education, there are so many other topics that come to the forefront of American politics, like climate change, minimum wage, social security, Medicare, environment, crime, military, abortion, taxation, federal budget deficit, trade, LGBTQ+, Wall Street, all of these things.
Yeah.
But, when I rattle all these things off, or like when people talk about them, what do you think? Like, there's so many things in the world, but we kind of select these handful of topics as the major issues that we like to discuss when we refer to politics.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think makes us choose these as the major issues that we discuss when we choose to discuss politics?
Yeah, I think a lot of these issues are things that definitely influence us on a daily basis. You brought up healthcare. You brought up something like education. And those are things that really directly influence us on a daily basis. And when I say us, I mean the majority of the country, the average American. But then there's a lot of other issues that are much more political than they are impactful. For example, something like, I don't know, like our policy on terrorism. That's something that obviously should exist and should happen, but does it need 40% of screen time for a debate or for, when you're covering a candidate's platform? Probably not. We are kind of conditioned to look for these things on a candidate's resume because that's the way that these candidates have been covered and will be covered. And obviously these issues are highlighted because they're issues of the time, but they also make for really good reporting and good TV. And so we have to be aware of how much of a candidate's platform is politics and made to be put under the spotlight as something to be argued about and debated about and elected on, versus how much of their platform is effectual things that will impact people's lives, and that involves looking at the legislation, looking at politicians have voted. Don't just look at what gets talked about on TV. Try to see what gets talked about on the House and Senate floor and what bills are senators and representatives writing that don't get covered. There's all sorts of things to pay attention to. For example, something like tax rates in certain districts. Those are things that will influence, again, who's moving into those districts, what's the quality of the public education there. Things like that aren't covered as much. So we just got to be aware of those things.
Mm-hmm. But, on a very basic level, like, forget about the House and Senate floor. Just think about your own house, like the house that you live in. What happens in your life on a daily basis? Like, those are the things that the government is there to help you with, is get through your daily life in an efficient and effective manner, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important to not get swept up by everything. It's obviously you want to be aware of everything, of course, but ultimately when it comes down to it, to make sure that you're properly being represented, make sure you're aware of the difficulties that you face throughout your daily life and bring that to the forefront of politics.
Yeah. Even if you don't think it's important, chances are a lot of people agree with you because, as an average American, and by average American, I just mean just anyone who's living here, working an honest job with honest values and a family, whatever, your struggles are probably more relatable than you think. So start at the local level, talk to your friends and family and go to your board of trustees, whatever local body is active in your community, and pitch them your ideas, pitch them your daily struggles. I think you brought up a good point that it doesn't have to be something that the House and Senate floor would be talking about or that would be covered on Fox News. It can be something super simple like, I think the mailboxes in my neighborhood are too close to the street. It's distracting my kids from driving, That's a really simple way that you can affect the safety of everyone in your community. So take those things to the local government.
Yeah, so, as a citizen at home, take into account the things that you're facing on a daily basis. Be aware, keep your eyes open. Make sure you're effectively utilizing democracy to make sure your voice is being heard.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said.
And it sounds kind of corny, but...
Well, it is corny, but corn is one of the main grains that this country was founded upon. We live in the breadbasket of America, big Ohio people, but I don't know. I might have said something contradictory in that pay attention to the big problems, but no, also pay attention to all the little things you can change in your own life. And it's not so much a contradiction as like a lifestyle piece of advice, because I guess the main takeaway is that focus on the problems that matter, and not on things that serve as that are spotlighted as a distraction from the things that matter. And there's really just two things that matter. Number one, the things that happen in your daily life that directly affect you, which are mostly solvable at the local level. And then number two, the really big structural decisions that are made at the federal or state level that affect everyone in like a trickle down way, where like a big sweeping policy is made. Maybe people don't even know the policy is made because they're being distracted by other news stories of like social movements or stuff like that. And suddenly something very basic like your tax bracket or something like that changes. So those are really the two big things to pay attention to study up on. And in that way, you will have greater empowerment in your participation in the country.
I think that's a great place to wrap up today's episode. And thank you so much for listening. If you made it this far, we'd love it if you leave a like and possibly consider subscribing.
Yeah.
But if not, no worries. We're glad
chill
to have you.
Yeah.
Either way. And yeah, we hope you join us for the next one.